Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today, we'll be looking back at some of the dramatic events that helped shape Israel and the Middle East in 2020. And warm welcome to this news review as we look back at those dramatic events that occurred in 2020 in Israel and the Middle East. And to join me in this programme today, I'm joined by Robin Benson, Christian political commentator, together with Brian Greenaway, Director of Mawaz Israel UK. So warm welcome to the programme. I'll start off with you, Robin. 2020 has been an extraordinary year. Not only have we had the impact of the COVID-19 global pandemic on Israel, we've also had the US presidential elections, we've had peace break out in the Middle East, and it looks almost certain that we're going to have a new president in the White House, a Democrat president who is not going to be as friendly as President Trump was in his administration towards Israel. Summing up, what kind of year do you think this has been for Israel and the Middle East? Big question, I know.
I think probably for Israel and the Middle East, it's been a year of total upheaval. Lots of things have gotten turned on their heads, whether, as you say, the COVID-19 and the drastic effect that that's had on the Israeli economy, the health system, everything, the Israeli dysfunctional government that eventually formed sort of at the spring of the year, which its dysfunctionality continues to this day. But I think probably the big thing is just a complete turnaround in Israel's relationships with several of the major and minor Muslim Arab states in the Middle East. No one thought that that was ever going to happen. And that's probably, I think, despite all the other things that are continuing to rumble on, the uncertainties of the presidential situation in the USA, that probably is the key major series of events that have happened in the last 2 or 3 months.
And Brian, what's your perspective on some of the major events that we've seen shape Israel and the Middle East in 2020?
Sure. Well, Israelis are used to turmoil, political turmoil, economic turmoil, but I expect they didn't expect, when this year started, to see what's happening now. That really, I think the average Israeli wants peace. They want a stable government, and they want to do their job, whatever that happens to be. But this year has just seen unprecedented unhappiness, really, with the government there. Bibi's always been popular, but I think, what has happened over this year and the political infighting, and we've seen some of the sort of cartoons on the street and political commentators saying, hey guys, you're arguing and we're dying. They've been pretty stark, some of what the people are saying to the politicians.
Absolutely. And 2020 started with literally a big bang. On the 3rd of January, we saw a US Predator drone take out Iran's chief general, and that's Soleimani in Iraq. So let's have a look at this CBN News report on the assassination of Iran's top military general.
The operation ordered by President Trump is already being called a seismic event in the Middle East for the killing of Qasem Soleimani, a person many considered one of the most dangerous men in the world. The Baghdad airport strike was targeted at Soleimani, the head of Iran's elite Quds force, killing a total of 8 people. Soleimani was identified by his hand and the ring he wore, shown in these photos. The Pentagon said in a statement General Soleimani was actively developing plans to attack American diplomats and service members in Iraq and throughout the region. General Soleimani and his Quds force were responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American and coalition service members and the wounding of thousands more. Soleimani was the architect of Iran's operations throughout the region and had been sanctioned by the U.S. and the UN for supporting terrorism. One former CIA officer told The New Yorker Soleimani was the most powerful operative in the Middle East. In Lebanon, Soleimani built Hezbollah into a powerful state within a state that threatens Israel. He was so famous in Iran, his image greeted passengers at Tehran airport. After the successful attack, President Trump tweeted the American flag. The State Department urged American citizens to leave Iraq immediately. The news caused spontaneous celebrations in Iraq, with some Iraqis dancing in the streets. This Iraqi said the U.S. attack will eliminate the corrupt parties which are destroying Iraq. At Friday prayers in Iran, worshippers chanted death to America. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei warned a harsh retaliation is waiting for the U.S., as did the spokesman for Iran's Revolutionary Guard, who cried during the interview with state TV. Around 5,000 American troops are based in Iraq, where they mainly train Iraqi forces and help to combat the Islamic State. Soleimani's death is being called a significant blow to Iran. The U.S. knew that Soleimani was behind this week's attack on the U.S. Embassy, and Defense Secretary Mark Esper had issued this warning on Thursday.
You know, enough is enough. We have all the capabilities inherent in the United States military to either respond to further attacks or to take preemptive action if additional attacks are being prepared.
U.S. officials have made it clear they're prepared to meet any response from Iran. To quote Defense Secretary Esper, the game has changed.
So that was the big groundbreaking event that shook the Middle East on the 3rd of January 2020. Robin, we have to talk about this because of its huge significance. Many in security experts, many in Europe, even those in the United States, said it was a bad idea to for the American government to actually assassinate General Soleimani, who has only been described as the godfather of Iranian international terrorism, thinking there would be huge reprisals, in which there hasn't been any real reprisals from the Iranian regime. How significant do you think this assassination was of Iran's top military general?
I think one of the things that came through this incident was it was clear that America and Israel and other allied nations had key significant information on the movements of this guy. They'd obviously been watching him for some time, and therefore they knew when was the best time to hit. So there's the aspect to it that it put Iran on notice that they were being watched, and that what they thought this guy could get away with, he could not. And eventually the time had come to take him out. Now, some of us may be uncomfortable with the action that was taken, but the reality is that this guy was the head of a prescribed terrorist organization who has been responsible. I mean, President Trump said millions of people. I think that's an overstating the case. He certainly was responsible directly or indirectly for the death of countless thousands of people. So he had the blood of thousands upon his hands, and it sent a warning to the Iranian regime that no one was safe. And yes, there was bluster, there was shouting, there were protests in Iran about what they were going to do. But in the end, as you said, Simon, introducing the question, in the end, they did very little, if anything. Yes, there probably were some retaliatory attacks against U.S. establishments in Iraq, but nothing wider than that. So it caused shockwaves through the Iranian regime, which I think is what the Trump administration and those that were part of it intended to do.
Absolutely. And Brian, I just want to move on very quickly about this one. I mean, this was really the first time since 2008 that the Americans have actually taken out one of the kind of chief terrorists of the Iranian regime, responsible really for turning the Middle East into a Shia dominant region, particularly with building up Hezbollah in Lebanon and the support of the of enemy forces across the Middle East. Certainly his loss was a huge blow to the Iranian regime, wasn't it?
It was, yes, yeah. And of course, a lot of these, with regard to Iran, there are many people in Iran who don't want to live with that regime. And so power is concentrated in a small group of people, the political leadership and the military leadership. They know that if they can take one of those guys out, I suppose that's their thinking, is that they can say, well, you know, we can take one of you, we can take all of you. And it wouldn't take much for an extreme political system to collapse if they were to start taking these guys out. So I suppose that's their thinking, isn't it?
Absolutely. So also remind us of what happened on the 8th of January, that the Iranian regime accidentally shot down a Ukrainian passenger plane in Iran, killing all 176 passengers on board, where most of them were either Iranian or Canadian, due to tensions running high over the assassination of the Iranian General Soleimani. And if we move on, there was a huge announcement that took place on the 28th of January 2020, and this was President Trump announcing his deal of the century, his Middle East plan, which his administration had been cocking up for years in order to bring this issue to the table, in which he also proposed a map of dividing the land of Israel and creating a Palestinian state. But this was described as the best deal that Israel could ever have. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think at the time, again, we were all surprised. We were taken aback that something that had been rumbling away in the background, we knew something was coming, but when the actual details started to come out and people started to pick it apart, I think there was a mix. There were a mix of reactions, because it was billed, yes, as the deal of the century, and it did offer the Palestinian Arabs a significant advance in what was potentially available to them as a society in trying to form a state. But there were those of us, including myself, who felt, yes, but we're still going, despite everything that's been said by President Trump, but everything that's in the document, it's still trying to sell a two-state solution. It's still trying to sell a dividing of the land. It's still trying to sell a dividing of Jerusalem. And, you know, there are many of us who are supportive of Israel and the Jewish people and who look at the scriptures and see that this is not something that the God of Israel wants. And therefore, I think on that basis, some of us felt this is just a reiteration with, you know, it's like the emperor's new clothes, with a new set of clothes, but actually it's still saying the same thing. It is making significant concessions to the Israelis as far as the so-called disputed territories in Judea and Samaria. So that we need to acknowledge, but it was still plowing the same furrow of dividing the land in two states for two people.
Absolutely. And this is what President Trump said. He says, today Israel takes a big step towards peace. Mr. Trump told officials and reporters at the White House, my vision presents a win-win opportunity for both sides, a realistic two-state solution that resolves the risk of Palestinian statehood to Israeli security. I remember a political commentator at the time saying that this is the best deal that Israel would ever get, and that the Israelis themselves very much embrace this deal, considering that this would defend Israeli sovereignty over their eternal capital to Jerusalem, would actually safeguard the Jewish settlements in Area C in Judea and Samaria, and means that the Palestinians would then have to come to the negotiation table. What are your thoughts, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, that is Trump, the deal breaker, isn't it, talking? He's more of a businessman than a politician. I think that maybe he's the one for taking risks, he always has been, bring things to the brink. And time and again, as we know, the Palestinians have been asked to come to the negotiating table and have said no. They don't seem to want to accept any deal. I suppose in the background, he's thinking to himself, well, they're going to refuse it anyway, so I'm going to go ahead with those who do agree. Israel agreed, it seemed. Other Arab nations are now connecting because of they agreed, and it's still the Palestinians who are saying, no, we're not going to come to the negotiating table. So he's carrying on with the part of the deal that he's brought to Israel. Maybe it's a risk he's taken, that he's thinking it will not end up with the two-state solution. Who knows? Israelis want peace at any cost. But
yeah, and there's also the fact that the Palestinians had said they weren't going to accept it before it was even published.
That's right.
You know, a good month before it was even published. So he, in that sense, you have to give him credit, because he has called their bluff in a way that no other president, maybe apart from Clinton with Yasser Arafat, has done in the past. And again, Trump is such a maverick, and he's not a politician per se, and therefore he could get away with that sort of behavior and actually then portrayed to the wider world. They have been offered, they were offered billions, and all sorts of concessions, and yet still they threw it back in the face of the President of the United States. And so, Trump was able to say, okay, guys, if you don't want it, we're going to move ahead with whatever. In the end, it came to nothing because other things took over, in its place. But it was a significant challenge to the Palestinian Arab leadership at the time.
Absolutely. So moving on now to February 2020, and in this month, on the 6th of February, we saw that Palestinian terrorists actually attacked Israeli soldiers in Jerusalem. The soldiers were new recruits working on protecting tourist destinations in Jerusalem, and the attack left 3 Palestinians dead and 12 Israeli soldiers. So we see a bit of disturbance there in February 2020. Moving on to March was a big day in Israel because we saw the Israeli general election, which showed that Likud won 36 seats and Netanyahu's bloc was short of a majority with only 58. Likud gained 235,554 more votes than in the last election and confirmed as the largest party ahead of the Blue and White Party with 33 seats. And Robin, we saw here, didn't we, that the election drama coming to an end. Israel in yet another general election, paralysed in 2019 with something like 3 general elections, and finally this one didn't deliver a result, but we know that they formed a government of national unity. What does this say about the vibrancy of Israeli democracy? Well, craziness of it.
I think that's the best way of describing it. It is a crazy democracy, and the reality is that there's no party is ever going to be able to form, as we have here, a 2-party system. They're always going to be dependent upon coalitions. And so you have this horse trading that goes on behind the scenes both before and after these general elections to try and cobble together a government that will work together. But, I think the Israeli public are long-suffering and they're willing to go back to the elections, although that's beginning to fray, I think, at the present time, as there's the anticipation of yet another one potentially, in the early part of the new year. But yes, it's wonderful, and it's a system that seems to work in a sense that they can vote, even though they don't vote a majority government into place. It still works in comparison to some of the other debacles we've seen in the last couple of months.
Yeah. And Brian, we also saw that Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has gone on to be Israel's longest ever serving Prime Minister and has actually been Prime Minister for consecutive, 11 years now, which is an extraordinary achievement, particularly in Israeli politics. What do you think this is down to?
I think he's a survivor, isn't he? That's what it is. And I think because for Israelis, they feel that they're safe with him. I remember on one of the elections, I think he went on air the night before and he sort of just said a few words about, do you want to be safe? And when it comes down to it, the economy is important, as are other things, but actually it's safety. And he is safe, for the national interests, militarily, against terrorism. He's always been the safe sort of bet. But I think the whole COVID situation definitely helped him this year because they just had to get together and do something to deal with that. So I think it's sort of, in a way, it's anaesthetised the politics for a while, but now they're beginning to get a grip on it. Maybe we're starting to move towards the end now. It's the budget is not yet been decided, so we're going to see more political turmoil, I think, next year.
Absolutely. And of course, we also saw that in March 2020, we saw the global pandemic hit Israel, and Israel was one of the first countries to go into national lockdown. So let's have a look at this video produced by Magen David Adom that looks at how they were responding to the challenge of COVID-19 in Israel.
Magen David Adom, the Israeli National EMS organization, is fighting the coronavirus spread using advanced means. Magen David Adom has been active for more than 90 years and is a member of the IFRC and is working collaboratively with the ICRC, providing humanitarian assistance in Israel and all over the world. Since the beginning of the global coronavirus outbreak, MDA has carefully monitored the trail of infection and has taken early preparation measures. The organization has increased the number of field responders, phlebotomists, and emergency medical vehicles, enlisted IDF reservists, members of the MDA Reserve Unit, trained many professional call takers for immediate one-on-one over-the-phone response, recruited volunteers to enlarge its force, trained its personnel in the use of personal protective gear, and swab testing. 82,000 emergency calls were answered a day by the call takers, EMTs, and paramedics at the National Operations Center, and many Israelis were approved to be swab tested for the virus. Calls were responded to by more than 500 call takers. MDA uses advanced innovative technological means in order to carefully manage the registry of thousands of callers and to maintain a chain of treatment that includes the Health Ministry's district physician and the Health Ministry itself, while utilizing a state-of-the-art command and control system developed by the organization, as well as an application that enables sending medical information and medical orders. In order to manage the growing number of patients, MDA opened drive-in test sites that can perform swab tests on thousands of people a day in a quick process that takes about 4 minutes. The first drive-in test site is operating in Tel Aviv, with 6 lanes manned by security guards, paramedics, and EMTs, who take thousands of swab tests a day. Additional drive-in test sites have been activated in major cities across Israel, and MDA team members are collecting swab samples from tens of thousands of Israelis each day. MDA and the Health Ministry are doing their utmost to provide rapid diagnostic services to patients in order to control the spread of the virus among the 9 million Israeli civilians and soldiers.
And that video was courtesy of Magen David Adom, showing what excellent work they were doing during the height of the pandemic in Israel. We have to discuss this really because Israel was one of the first countries to go into national lockdown, where Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu closed the borders very quickly. Israelis couldn't actually walk more than half a mile from their actual homes. And also we saw in Israel as well that, there was very, very tough and very strict conditions attached to try and combat the virus. It was pretty difficult for Israelis living under these conditions, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. Conditions that probably most of them had never experienced before in their lives. The level of restriction. Being Israel, there were those who obeyed them, and there were those who just totally ignored them. And I know there was a lot. I'm sure you would be aware of it too, Brian. A lot of aggravation against certain population groups within Israeli society, both Arab and Jewish, who just totally ignored the government restrictions and actually saw upticks in infection rates within those populations. So again, as you would expect, after 2 years living in Israel, as you would expect, a very mixed reaction. And there were some now who look back on it and would say, was it necessary or not? Was the complete lockdown actually effective or not? I guess time will tell, when people look back on it, historians and so on.
And Brian, considering that your organisation is I can describe as a messianic humanitarian organisation, what impact did COVID had on the work of Ma'oz Israel?
Well, it was massive for the country, as Robin has already said, and effectively over 1 million people losing their source of income. But what we did, in fact, this year has been one of our most successful years as a ministry. We've given over $1 million shekels in aid to families, directly to families. Now, this is 5 times more people than we've ever helped in a given year. And that meant putting money into their bank account because there was, we talk about furloughing and the other aid packages here and in other European countries, but Israel didn't have a package like that. And so we've just seen the miraculous, really. God has directed us and led us. There was families that were praying and saying, Lord, help us. And they'd get a call from Ma'oz and we'd be able to put money into their banks so they can buy food. So for us, it's been a year of opportunity. It's been a tough year. It's been really tough for many families, but it has been opportunity for us to help families and to share the love of God through that.
Absolutely. So in April 2020, on April the 6th, it appears that the coronavirus actually brought unity in Israel, and we saw the growing tensions in Israel come to an end when we saw that the Likud party and the Blue and White party came together to form a government of national unity after well over a year. So let's have a look at this CBN news report on this coalition government between Likud and the Blue and White party.
Just before the opening ceremony for Holocaust Remembrance Day, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Blue and White leader Benny Gantz signed an agreement on a national unity government. The move prevents Israelis from going to an unprecedented fourth round of elections. Netanyahu and Gantz each tweeted their response. Netanyahu said, "I promise the State of Israel a national emergency government that will work to save the lives and livelihoods of the citizens of Israel." Gantz said, "We prevented a fourth election. We will protect democracy. We will battle corona, and we will worry about all the citizens of Israel. We have an emergency unity government." The deal leaves Netanyahu in office for the next 18 months as prime minister, with Gantz as the deputy prime minister. Then they swap positions in October 2021. The COVID-19 pandemic and its fallout are credited with pushing the leaders into an agreement. Gantz's campaign focused on getting rid of Netanyahu, who has been indicted on charges of fraud and breach of trust. About 2,000 Israelis protested earlier against the unity government, but most just breathed a sigh of relief.
I think people have been waiting for the leaders of both the Likud and Blue and White to put this unity government together. This is the kind of situation where you don't want to have a political battle. You don't want to have disagreements about what should have been done or what shouldn't have been done. You want the country to pull together.
The deal puts Israel back on track to implement President Trump's peace plan and apply sovereignty in biblical Judea and Samaria when maps are finalized in July. Former Israeli ambassador to the UN, Dori Gold, told CBN News that for now, the main thing is dealing with corona.
What we need to do is get this resolved. I'm talking about the medical side. And then we'll go back to the diplomacy, where I think Israel has historical rights and an urgency in light of what's going on with Iran and the countries of the region to make sure that we have defensible borders.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News.
Report put together there by Chris Mitchell of CBN, talking about finally a government of national unity. We've seen really that for a whole year of 2019, ever since Israel called that general election, that the Israelis couldn't get their act together. And finally, it was COVID-19 that pushed the Blue and White Party together with Likud to form another government of national unity, with Netanyahu becoming prime minister until September 2021, and then Benny Gantz taking over after that. And we've seen that there are a lot of strains now within this coalition. So the question is, can it last? But how important was it that the Israeli political forces came together to meet the challenge posed by COVID-19?
Well, I think they had no other option, because things were going so badly at that point, and the general population was getting more and more agitated at their inability to sit down and, bang their heads together and come to some sort of agreement. But, within a day or two, Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party basically fell apart. People just dived away because he went back on what he had stated before the election, that he wouldn't go into coalition with Bibi Netanyahu and the Likud. Now, I know they did it supposedly for the sake of the country because of the COVID-19, but sadly, in the heels of the hunt, we watch this video and there's two senior politicians, leaders in the land of Israel, and neither of them trust the other, both publicly and privately. And you think, come on, that the nation is in desperate need of leadership, and all you seem to be able to do is to be with each other and your parties with each other as to who's the most important politically. And it's crazy, just crazy.
And also in April, we saw that the Saudi Arabian coalition fighting the rebels in Yemen declared a 2-week ceasefire to stop the spread of the coronavirus. And this happened for the first time in the 5-year conflict. And now moving on to May 2020. On the 18th of May, 19 people died and 15 were injured when an Iranian naval exercise resulted in an accident in the Gulf of Oman. Officials originally stated the accident was due to a misdirected missile attack, but later they revised their statement. And then on the 17th of May, in Israel, the Government of National Unity was actually signed. And then moving on really to June 2020, we saw that thousands of Israeli protesters protested on June the 12th in Lebanon. We saw that the Lebanese currency rapidly fell. Many Lebanese citizens took to the streets in anti-government protests, and these protests were set up by burning barricades and forced road closures, as some of the protesters threw rocks at police and others tried to climb the security fence surrounding the Prime Minister's house. So, we saw there big problems, I think, in Lebanon, and we saw other protests as well in Iraq. And this was pretty much to do with the kind of Iranian interference in those countries. So, again, I think this is people trying to take back control in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. What do you say?
Yeah, we've watched effectively over the last few years Lebanon just fall apart, particularly since Hezbollah has effectively become a government and an army within a government and an army. And is controlling Lebanon on the ground. I mean, the government effectively that is there just seems to be puppets at the beck and call of Hezbollah. And the general man in the street has had enough of it because it's so affecting his life. And hence we saw the protests. And the same was in Iraq. The corruption in the Iraqi government was undermining the whole economy, people's livelihoods and everything else. And so people took to the streets to protest. And it's just another ripple effect of this general discontent, again, on top of the COVID-19 crisis, which is affecting much of the Middle East at this time, as it still is today.
And Brian, we also have to, we're going to touch on this a bit later in August, but really, this is the first time that young Lebanese people took to the street to say that we're sick and tired of our government being controlled by Hezbollah and that we want freedom. How important is it that other Arab nations have the same freedom that Israel does?
Yes, it's very important. I remember listening to an interview with young, I think, journalists and politicians from the UAE and Bahrain who were saying, we've always had an education system that's focused on our differences rather than what we have in common. But some of the education systems in these countries have changed so that young people are saying, hey, look, let's see what we've got in common. And I think that's happening across the Middle East. I suppose social media has an impact on that. But people are saying, hey, guys, this is the story we've always been sold, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so younger people are rising up in media, in politics, and the man on the street and saying that it doesn't have to be this way. Beirut was a beautiful city, a wonderful city.
It's called the Switzerland of the Middle East in the 60s.
Right, yes,
and in July 2020, we saw that thousands of Israelis protested in front of the Prime Minister's residence, demanding the resignation of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over the indictment on corruption charges, as well as his handling of the COVID-19 crisis and the economy. And then moving on to August of 2020. And on the 4th of August, a giant explosion took place in Beirut in Lebanon that killed 135 people and injured another 5,000 people. Many are still missing, and the explosion had an impact on over 300,000 people who've been displaced from their homes. And on the 5th of August, it was revealed that the blast may have been caused by stored ammonite nitrate, which many blamed as a fire at a warehouse that took Lebanon's capital city, Beirut, ablaze, which many are blaming Hezbollah. So let's have a look at this live archive action of this huge explosion that took place in Lebanon on the 4th of August 2020.
عندنا حريق كبير في مرفأ بيروت. لا عطرة يا عطرة البناية يا عطرة انفجار نووي.
good, I'm good.
What is it? Oh,
Hey,
We all saw the terrible explosion at Beirut port last month. Now here's where the next explosion could take place, right here. This is the Beirut neighborhood of Janah. And here, Hezbollah is keeping a secret arms depot, a meter away from a gas company. I say to the people of Janah, you've got to act now. You've got to protest this. Because if this thing explodes, it's another tragedy. Iran and Hezbollah have deliberately put you and your families in grave danger. And that is why the international community must insist that Hezbollah stop using Lebanon and Lebanese civilians as human shield.
And that video there was courtesy of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. Now, also what happened in August 2020 was the announcement of the Abraham Accords, a peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. This is probably the biggest news story, I think, to affect Israel in 2020. Robin, when we see that one of Israel's former Arab enemies, the United Arab Emirates, ended up reaching out to Israel to sign the historic peace agreement between the two nations. How significant was this in terms of Israel's recognition for her place in the Middle East?
Mega. I mean, there's no other word for it. This was ripples across the Middle East, ripples across the Arab Muslim world in a way that none of us ever expected to see. So, yeah. And behind it, obviously, there is the fear of Iranian Shiite interference right throughout the region, and the realization that Israel is their friend when it comes to opposing Iranian interference. And this, I think, most commentators would now recognize this is what has driven the UAE and other Arab Muslim nations to enter into these agreements with Israel, because they recognize they need the support. They need what Israel has to offer. Yes, you've got the Americans behind that, but it's also what Israel has to offer on the ground.
And also, we have to give President Trump a lot of credit for initiating this historic peace agreement that first started with the United Arab Emirates, Brian, then finished with Bahrain, and then followed by Morocco wanting to make peace with Israel, as well as Sudan. And what's extraordinary, I think, about this peace agreement was the fact that it was that the people of the United Arab Emirates and the Gulf states want a genuine friendship with Israel, that this is a warm peace. What are your thoughts?
Yes, definitely is. It was a surprise. Israelis welcomed it. Any thought of peace, great. That's good news. And of course, about 10,000 Israelis have already gone or are on their way there for holidays and shopping and everything. So it's a people connection, isn't it? It really is very much a people connection. Both countries can see the benefit of it. Israelis love the idea of peace, and not everybody's at their throat anymore. And the benefits for UAE, yes, I mean, people talk about the military benefits, the support from the states, but also there's Israeli technology. Particularly countries like Sudan, who's 80% agrarian, the great Israeli technology in agriculture would really help them.
Absolutely. So let's also then look at this video that marked this historic peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Was first announced in August 2020.
flight number 971 from Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi. הנחנו את התשתיות לחילופין של אנשים, סחורות וכסף. יצאנו פה שותף אמיתי וטוב, ואנחנו צריכים עכשיו ליישם את מה שהסכמנו על התשתיות.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
שלום עליכם וברכותיו.
أنا فخور وفرحان جدا بوجودي هنا كرئيس.
אני גאה מאוד ושמח מאוד להיות פה, כראש המשלחת הישראלית.
وصلنا هنا من شأن تحويل رؤية إلى واقع.
And thanks to the Israeli Foreign Ministry for allowing us to use that video item that explains this historic peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. So, on to September 2020, and on the 15th of September, we saw the lavish signing of the Abraham Accords on the grounds of the White House lawn, where Israel signed a peace agreement not only with the United Arab Emirates, but with also Bahrain. We also saw on the 25th of September that Israel was the first country, Western country, to go into another lockdown in order to defeat COVID-19. And going on to October 2020, we see that Israel and Sudan entered into a normalization agreement. And President Trump announced that Sudan and Israel had signed an agreement to normalize relations. The agreement is designed to end the turbulent relationship between the two states, and the two nations agreed to meet soon to discuss cooperation in the areas previously discussed. And they sought after, which became another foreign policy triumph for President Trump and his administration. Now, moving on to November, we had the very controversial US presidential elections that has a profound impact upon Israel. Robin, what are your thoughts on this controversial US presidential elections? Because we've seen that President Trump was such a great friend of Israel, and the policies in which he enacted did everything they could to protect Israel, to confront Israel's enemies, make the Palestinians realize that they were never going to go back to prior Israel's formation of a modern state back in 1948, so keeping the conflict alive for 72 plus years. What are your thoughts on really what emerged with the US presidential elections and its impact on Israel?
As we sit here discussing this, it looks like Joe Biden is going to be in the White House, sworn in on January the 20th next year. I can't see how that's going to turn around now. I think it has gone too far. There are too many rejections of these legal disputes and so on. So we have to now look forward into 2021 with the reality of a Democratic administration with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Not to take away anything from what you said, Simon, and what President Trump has done. He has been the most positive pro-Israel president probably in US history, if you actually look at the things that he's done in the 4 years that he's been in the White House. But I come back to the same thing I've said before. The God of Israel is sovereign. He has used President Trump and the Republican administration. God will use President Biden and the Democratic administration to take his plan forward. Because it's not about nations and it's not about presidents. It's about the God of Israel, the God of heaven, and his kingdom and his plan and his purposes. And no one and nothing is going to thwart that. Now, we may balk at the thought of what will go with that as Biden administration comes in, all the other social and moral issues that people were very concerned about. But when it comes to Israel and the Jewish people, God will have his way. And we have got to learn to live with that reality as believers and people who are supportive of Israel and the Jewish people, and not be afraid and not be worried about it.
Brian, for the past 4 years since we've seen that President Trump has been in the White House, we've seen that President Trump has been a great friend of Israel. We saw history being made. We saw the American embassy move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. We saw President Trump recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. we saw for the first time a US administration say that the settlements in Judea and Samaria are not illegal under international law. We saw the first time President Real takes strong firm of action against the Palestinian Authority to completely cut its funding, defending Israel and the United Nations. And he goes down also getting rid of the terrible Iran nuclear deal as well, and put Iran on notice. And the world felt like a safer place. And also what was so encouraging is to have so many evangelical Christians in his administration as well that had a heart for Israel. Now, comparing to what we have with the Democrats and with Kamala Harris as the vice president and her worldview, we see probably a very anti-Israel administration coming up in the line with Joe Biden and with Kamala Harris. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, speaking today, we don't know what's going to happen in the next few weeks. It's very interesting, isn't it? And I think that sometimes it's caused us as believers to have an evaluation of where we put our trust, because we may think, putting our trust in presidents or prime ministers, where I think that sometimes when things aren't going with us, then we need to make that decision. And maybe Israel and the evangelical community in America will need to say to themselves, right, okay, who is it we trust in? Is it God we trust in? And, when you've got things going well for you politically, and Israel love President Trump, there is a day coming when they're going to have to acknowledge God and acknowledge his plan and his purposes and look to him. So maybe, maybe this may be a testing time, but maybe they'll start to turn to the Lord more.
And also in November the 19th, we saw that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo toured one of the Jewish settlements in Samaria and also visited the Golan Heights, in which President Trump a year earlier recognised Israeli sovereignty over that strategic plateau that borders Syria. This was quite extraordinary, wasn't it, this visit by Mike Pompeo, who is an evangelical Christian, loves Israel, was the first Secretary of State ever to visit Judea and Samaria, and the first one ever to visit the Golan Heights. How significant was this visit?
Well, I think the last time I was with you, Simon, we did discuss this, and it is significant. Not only the fact that Mike Pompeo visited these areas, because that gives, from the American perspective, at least through the American lenses, that gives a further level of legitimacy to the decisions that the Trump administration took. But it also is saying to the rest of the international community, this is the decision that this administration has taken. Whether you like it or not, we're recognizing it. Now, what happens after January 20th, we'll see. And we did talk about it at the time that it may even be Mike Pompeo's way of sticking a stake in the ground and saying, maybe sometime in the future, I'm going to be a candidate for the highest office in the US government.
And the other major news event to break at the end of November was the Iran's top nuclear scientist, Farzadeh, was killed on what appeared to be an assassination. And on the 2nd of December, a top US official reported that the assassination was carried out by Israel, believed to be the work of the Mossad. This was, the year started with the assassination of the Iranian general Soleimani, and the year looks like it's ending with the assassination of Iran's chief nuclear scientist, the godfather of Iran's nuclear weapons project. And the ease in which the Israeli Mossad agents, believed to be Mossad agents, that is, carried out this assassination attempt must have sent shockwaves into the heart of the Islamic Republic of Iran. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely, that is true. If it was Mossad, there's no official confirmation. But if it was, Israel, they're born to survive, aren't they? We know people since 1948, they've had to survive, and they can look after themselves, and they say, we will look after ourselves. And that's what they see, that they see the danger. Bibi went on record as saying this is what they're doing in Iran. He wanted the world to see that. And if people don't take any notice, then Israel will take direct action.
And there's also the fact that this guy, Fakhrizadeh, or however
that's a very good pronunciation.
His name is pronounced, was also part of a world-recognized and prescribed terrorist organization, not only in the nuclear field, but in military fields. So again, he is responsible also for the death of countless hundreds and thousands of people. Mm-hmm. So the fact that much of the political and diplomatic world were up in arms about Israel doing what they did speaks more to their delusion that this guy, was pioneering some domestic nuclear program and not involved in terrorist activity. It's denial of the reality of what this guy was all about.
And it will also put back Iran's nuclear weapons program.
As the attacks during the early part of the year on the facilities did.
So moving on to this month and December 2020, on the 10th of December, Morocco and Israel agreed to establish diplomatic relations, and Morocco becomes only the 6th Arab country to recognise Israel. On the 12th of December, we see that Bhutan establishes its diplomatic relations with Israel. So that was 2020 in a nutshell, a very, I would say, interesting and profound year for Israel and the Middle East. Brian, summing up, we've seen these incredibly dramatic events take place in Israel and the Middle East in 2020 with COVID-19, with the peace agreements breaking up between Israel and the Arab world, together with the Iranian threat and Iran being curtailed. But 2021 looks like it could be even more explosive than 2020. What are your thoughts?
Yes, definitely. Well, we know what the Bible tells us. There is a common destiny for the Arab people and the Jewish people. Maybe we're beginning to see that form now. We have a common beginning and we have a common end. We look at what the scriptures say, and who knows what might happen next. We may not have Trump on the scene, but God is still working. He's still working.
Absolutely. And Robin, when we look at these dramatic events, the reason why we look at Israel so closely is not only because it's a biblical command and God's put a love of Israel and the Jewish people on our hearts, but we're seeing that Israel is also God's prophetic time clock. And surely these events that we're seeing in the Middle East are really gearing up the world for the return of Israel's Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach.
Totally. And as I said earlier in the program, God's in control of this situation. The scripture is full of his plan and purpose, and we need to read it and get in line with what God is saying and what God is doing.
Absolutely. So, Robin and Brian, thank you so much for being my guests on this special edition of the Middle East Report as we reviewed the news that's impacted Israel and the Middle East in 2020. And I want to thank you for watching today's programme. To all our viewers, I want to wish you all a wonderful new year. We pray it's going to be a better year than 2020, but there can be no doubt about some of the earth-breaking events that shaped Israel and the Middle East in 2020. With COVID-19, with these new peace agreements with the Arab world that everyone thought was impossible, together with the Iranian regime being curtailed. Now, with the prospect of the Democrats being in the White House, we know that this will be a tough year for Israel in 2021. And that's why it's vital that we continue to pray for Israel, that we continue to pray for the Jewish people, and as believers that we contend for the truth in what seems such a difficult era to proclaim truth, and certainly biblical truth in this day and this age. So I want to wish you all a wonderful 2021 and keep watching the Middle East Report.